Welcome back to Genuine Questions. This is not the part 2 that I promised that I was going to do when we left off on the last video. So we're going to call this part 1.5. Because today I just feel like telling the story of the boys on the tracks. And I've talked about it in a couple of videos, haven't got into a lot of the details, but it's the murder of Don Henry and Kevin Ives back in the late 80s, and I think it is a very interesting true crime case, and there's a couple of different documentaries that you can watch about it online where I got these clips from, but they're all pretty dated from like back in the 80s, early 90s when stuff happened, and so the video footage is pretty grainy, but the information is good and the story is interesting. They should make a movie out of this, but if you like to read, there's a book called The Boys on the Tracks by Mara Levitt, I think is the author of it. I don't have it here on my bookshelf to double check that though. The reason why I wanted to put this video in here as a part 1.5 instead of just waiting till later is because it relates to the case that we talked about in part 1, which is the investigation into the Mina airport and the cocaine smuggling and money laundering that was going on there. But we'll just start off here with this introductory clip where the mother of one of the victims sort of explains the initial overview of the crime.
17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry were struck by a train near Alexander. The medical examiner has said that the boys were asleep and drugged with marijuana. The parents, however, disputed that claim and persuaded authorities to reopen the case.
On August 22nd, 1987, Kevin had spent the night with his friend Don Henry. They left Don's home around 12:30 or 1:45. The next thing we knew, they had been run over by a train. There seems to be a small airstrip in the area. There have been sightings and reports of small airplanes flying very low with lights off in the area. I believe they saw something they shouldn't have seen.
Despite the evidence to the contrary, local officials were immediately treating the case as an accident, while at the same time concealing or denying evidence such as the green tarp that the boys' bodies were covered with, or the rifle that they had with them at the time. The investigation was so shoddy that they even left behind Kevin's foot on the train tracks, which wasn't discovered until 2 days later. Despite all the bungling right off the bat, Saline County Sheriff Jim Steed would proclaim he was pleased with the thorough investigation after those same 2 days.
3 weeks later, their deaths were ruled accidental by the state medical examiner, Fahmy Malik. We disagreed with that ruling, and the facts didn't add up to what he was telling us, so we decided to get a second opinion and met with resistance from all fronts, both with our local law enforcement, with the state crime lab. We obtained court orders requesting samples of everything that the crime lab had for a second opinion. Fahmy Malik resisted court orders. He refused to obey them.
So at the end of that clip, Linda Ives was talking about Fahmy Malik, who was the state medical examiner, which is a position that was appointed by the governor, which at the time was Bill Clinton. And this next clip will go into the history of Fahmy Malik and his shady rulings and blatant corruption that was going on at the state medical examiner's office.
After the autopsy, Malik ruled that Kevin and Don had smoked 20 pot joints and fell asleep on the tracks, and thus didn't hear the train blowing its whistle as it was bearing down on them. Enter pathologist Joseph Burton of Atlanta, who was brought in and would find that Kevin had been beaten in the head with the butt end of a rifle, and Don had been stabbed in the back, both prior to being placed on the tracks, which would explain the thickness of their blood at the time of their deaths, as witnessed by the train's engineers and emergency first responders to the scene.
Burton's autopsies also revealed that Malik had mutilated Kevin's skull by sawing it in so many different directions that it was impossible to tell where the original skull fractures were. Malik also had completely dismantled Kevin's jawbones. Burton stated he had performed thousands of autopsies and had never seen anything like it.
A former employee at the crime lab has said he discovered what appeared to be evidence of a stab wound during the original autopsy, but was told, quote, not to worry about it. Malik has refused all comment
As long as Malik's rulings pleased the governor's office or state police, they were left to stand, no matter how implausible.
During the midst of all of the turmoil with trying to get the ruling changed in our case, it became very apparent that this was not an isolated instance of an error in the ruling on the manner of death. There were many other cases statewide that we became aware of.
In 1992, the Los Angeles Times tallied more than 20 additional cases where Dr. Malik had falsified evidence and ruled incorrectly. One case involved the murder of Raymond Albright, who had been shot 5 times in the chest with a Colt .45. Incredibly, Malik had ruled suicide. Another involved James Dewey Milam, whose body was found without the head. In this case, Malik ruled the cause of death to be an ulcer. Although Milam's head had been clearly severed with a knife, Malik claimed the family pooch had bitten off the head, eaten the entire thing, and then regurgitated. Malik says he tested the dog's vomit and found traces of Milam's brain and skull. Unfortunately for Dr. Malik, Milam's head was later found. Malik, it turns out, had made up the entire story. Nevertheless, both Governor Clinton and the Arkansas State Medical Examiner Commission Chairman, Jocelyn Elders, who had the power to remove Malik from office, not only insisted he remain, they gave him a raise.
Based on the facts I have, I really feel that Arkansas owes Dr. Malik a great debt and a real apology.
There were allegations of tampering with evidence in murder cases. There were allegations of perjury in different cases. It didn't seem to matter what Malik did. Clinton protected him. He made excuses such as he's overworked, he's just stressed out, he's underpaid. They gave him a $14,000 raise, which was an insult to my family as well as a lot of others in the state who to this day are struggling with asinine rulings in the deaths of children and other loved ones.
So I've said before in these videos that there is a difference between being wrong about something and lying about something. And as evidenced from that video, this state medical examiner, Fahmy Malik, was lying about the autopsy results in murder cases in the state of Arkansas. If he said he tested the dog's vomit and found the guy's brain in there, or pieces of his skull, or whatever disgusting thing that he said that he did that because he tested it. But if they found the guy's head later, then there's no way that that is true. He also, in the case of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, says that they were just so high that they decided to both lay horizontally across these railroad tracks, and they were so stoned that they didn't hear the train coming, and they got run over by a train, and that's how they died. That's ridiculous. That's obviously not true. And when the family fought tooth and nail to get this second autopsy, they find out, oh, they were dead before they were put on the tracks. That's very suspicious that the medical examiner would lie about the autopsy results in this accidental train death. It turns out he never even did a toxicology examination on these kids to see if they had marijuana in their system. He just made it up. And he was rewarded with a $14,000 raise by Bill Clinton, who, through the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, has ties to the Mena Airport. As we'll go through the story, you'll see how this murder of these two boys on the tracks relates back to that. But to get started with that, we'll watch this next clip, who introduces the person, the leader of the drug task force in Saline County, Arkansas, a woman named Jean Duffy. And here's her story of what happened to her when she got assigned to lead this drug task force.
In the beginning of 1990, Jean Duffy was appointed to head the newly created 7th Judicial District Drug Task Force that was formed to look into the drug and corruption problems going on in the Saline County area and other surrounding counties as well. But immediately on Duffy's first day on the job as head of the task force, She was told not to look into anything involving government officials by her immediate supervisor, Gary Arnold.
Gary Arnold came into my office, stood in front of my desk, looked me straight in the face, and said, "Jean, you are not to use the Drug Task Force to investigate any public official." He turned on his heel and marched out. Now, as startling as that statement might sound, I really didn't think that it was going to pose any kind of problem, because at that time I didn't have any indication that there was any public official in our judicial district who was involved in drugs. It didn't occur to me that it was appropriate for our Drug Task Force to reopen the case of the boys on the track until one of my undercover officers came to me and told me that not only was the case drug-related, but it was also solvable. He asked permission to investigate, and I agreed to that and told him that we would take our information then to Bob Govar. And the connections that we made almost immediately led to several public officials. And the person whose name came up immediately and most frequently was Dan Harmon.
Dan Harmon is a very interesting character because he is not only the prosecutor who is trying to get to the bottom of who murdered these boys and placed them on the railroad tracks, but as you will hear here in a minute, he's also probably the guy, definitely the guy, who placed them there.
Dan Harmon was just a local attorney in the town of Benton, Arkansas.
And by the time Fahmy Malek had made his ridiculous ruling, Harmon actually convinced Judge John Cole to appoint himself, Harmon, as special prosecutor in the original grand jury investigation into the boys' murders. Harmon and his best friend and assistant prosecutor, Richard Garrett, approached the Ives family and embraced them as friends, and promised them they would find the killers of Kevin and Don. Little did the Ives family know at the time, though, that Dan Harmon himself was actually involved in the murders of Kevin and Don, which in hindsight now makes sense, understanding why Harmon made sure he was appointed to the case.
He approached Linda Ives and the Henry family about trying to help them. He helped lead them down a path that absolutely led to nowhere on this case.
We certainly don't have any suspects at this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started. I'm frustrated in the amount of time that it's taken. Frustrated that we weren't able to accomplish some things we probably should have been able to. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
But it still will leave the open question, if the boys were murdered, who did it?
Well, until it's solved, that's correct.
To make matters worse, Harmon suddenly became the prosecutor-elect for a 3-county district, which included Saline County. Harmon, who had friends in the Arkansas press, wasted no time in launching a massive media smear campaign against Jean Duffy.
I believe in part 1 there were 3 different people, a state investigator, Russell Welch, the IRS investigator, Tim Duncan, and then there was the reporter whose name I think was Scott Wheeler, if I remember all those names correctly. They all faced personal and professional consequences for going down this road and investigating these ties to the CIA operation at the Mena airport. And you'll see in this next video the same thing is going to happen to that woman, Jean Duffy, who we just saw, who is leading the drug task force. Now that Dan Harmon, the man she is investigating, is the prosecutor, he uses his contacts in the media to plant false stories about her and smear her reputation and get her under investigation to the point where it gets so bad that she has to flee the state of Arkansas.
Judge John Cole and prosecutors Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett brought the grand jury to a close on December 31st, 1988, with the grand jury evidence and reports suppressed and not allowed on record.
Harmon had paid a visit to Chuck Banks, the U.S. District Attorney, who was in charge of that district. It's recorded, he signed in. He was there approximately 30 minutes, and up until that time, everything appeared to be running fine with the grand jury.
Although there was an abundance of evidence and word kept reaching me from members of the grand jury that they were ready to indict, no indictments came. Mr. Govar also insisted that he was ready to prosecute at least 2 key figures, but the holdup was his boss, U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, who repeatedly delayed requests for indictments.
I look back on the chain of events and realize that I likely caused the shutdown of my own investigation. It's clear to me that the turning point was when I gave Chuck Banks the information developed by my task force that the boys were killed because they had stumbled upon a large shipment of drugs dropped from an airplane. In my heart, I feel that that was a red flag that caused Chuck Banks to close the investigation down before it led to Mina.
So in June of 1990, Dan Harmon became the district's prosecutor-elect. The first news conference or news interview that he gave, he used the entire interview to begin to discredit me. There were daily allegations of everything from misspending funds to ordering illegal arrests. Every attempt was made to keep me from running the drug task force. We were even shut down completely for several weeks during a bogus state police investigation. Then, in November, Banks removed Govar from the case, and I was fired from the task force.
Eventually, Gene Duffy's name would be so completely smeared in a public campaign led by Dan Harmon through the media, who printed everything he told them with no evidence, and combined with a statewide subpoena issued for Duffy and her task force's evidence to appear before Judge John Cole, the same judge who appointed Harmon as a special prosecutor to the original grand jury investigation, and who also closed that grand jury without letting the jurors enter their findings into the public record. Well, Duffy was wise, and she left the state and became a school teacher in Texas until her name could be later cleared by the FBI.
In January 1991, Dan Harmon took office as the 7th Judicial District Prosecutor. Harmon immediately called a state grand jury to investigate the allegations against me. To avoid being jailed in Hot Spring County, which would have put me in serious danger, I left the state. In the meantime, Banks, who had taken over the federal investigation, attempted to give the appearance of carrying the investigation forward while systematically destroying it. He harassed witnesses, suppressed evidence, and finally announced in February of 1991 that the investigation had disclosed no credible witnesses or evidence against any public official.
I don't have the clip prepared because I actually just thought of this while watching that playback, but it's a lot like the tactic that Nancy Pelosi explained to everybody during that press conference that she had titled the wrap-up smear, where you plant false rumors about somebody to your contacts in the media, and then they print the rumors you've reported, and then you use that as justification. You use those media reports as your justification to now smear this person and discredit them based on the rumor that you made up. And the reason why I think that is the tactic that Dan Harmon is employing against Gene Duffy, and not that Dan Harmon is the noble prosecutor taking down the corrupt drug task force like he would like you to believe, because if you fast forward the story to several years later, Gene Duffy's name does get cleared by the FBI, and Dan Harmon himself actually gets arrested for drug-related crimes. So the evidence seems to stack up that, yes, he was involved in these types of illegal activities while he was an elected official. This next video is about another investigator who was run out of town because he started looking into the Mina airport and the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives and the connections to Dan Harmon.
Meet Saline Detective John Brown, who enters the story in 1993.
My immediate supervisor, who was a lieutenant over the Saline County Criminal Investigation Division, took me for a ride that lasted approximately 1 hour. During this ride to literally nowhere, it appeared the whole purpose was to tell me to leave the case alone. He said things like, there's not anything to this. This could have been an accident. It's going to bring you a lot of grief if you continue on and do this. And in the end, he finally said, you know, John, you really need to leave this alone. It became obvious that once I started going through the case file, it had been robbed of most of the pertinent evidence.
Here's an FBI document from a later investigation in the mid-1990s showing that there was indeed evidence missing from the case files, which states, quote, evidence from this case to include a sketch of the accident scene, cigarette butts left at the accident site, pictures of the crime scene, plus the original case files are missing, end quote. Also from this FBI document we can see, quote, Saline County officials are baffled that some of the original evidence collected during 1987 is no longer available and that files are missing, end quote.
I got involved in the case and immediately Harmon tried to discredit me without even knowing me. I run across a young lady named Charlene Wilson who told a horror story that I didn't really believe at the time. So I started searching for evidence to substantiate just part of what she had said. Harmon went ballistic. Called, he threatened me, threatened Sheriff Pridgeon, threatened Captain Gene Donham, the chief deputy. All because I talked to this one woman.
I am only showing a small part of the Charlene Wilson story and how it pertains to the murder of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. She actually has a lot of testimony that also ties the Clintons to the Mena Airport and the Arkansas Development Finance Authority and the cocaine trafficking with his friend Dan Lassiter. And that's all a very interesting story as well. And so if you would like to see more of what Charlene Wilson has to say, I'll put the links to the longer documentaries in the description. For the purposes of this video, you just need to know that Charlene Wilson was like sort of dating or associated with Dan Harmon, and she was on the tracks with him the night that the boys were murdered and placed there. So she is eyewitness testimony to the fact they were murdered, and Dan Harmon is involved.
What was it about Wilson that got Harmon so up in anger when investigators into the deaths of the boys would start questioning her?
Charlene was recommended to our task force as an informant from DEA, who had used her as an informant, and also from at least 2 other law enforcement agencies that had used her as an informant and said that she was reliable.
I was subpoenaed to testify on behalf of the drug trafficking and the cartel, more or less is what it was, that had to do with Dan Harmon and what I call company. The people at the track that night, to my knowledge, were Dan Harmon, Keith McCaskill, Larry Rochelle. I do know that the boys were watching the drop site and they got curious as to what was being dropped there. I received a phone call and they told me that I had made a very big mistake. And I was assured by the U.S. Attorney's Office that my name, that my testimony, that my statements, that the people that were on that witness list would never, ever be revealed. Well, ha, you know. Someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office had given Mr. Harmon a list of the effective witnesses, you know. Some of them witnesses over a period of time have came up dead and or missing or have never been heard of again. I'm scared of these people. I'm very scared of them.
Guess who arrested her? Dan Harmon. The very guy that she says turned her on to drugs now has her arrested.
Dan Harmon, he walked to me, handed me what was supposed to be a search warrant, and he said, bitch, excuse me for saying that, I told you if you ever brought my name up or brought anything up about the past dealings that we've had, that I'd take you down. He said, you're going to prison. I'm going to put you in prison. He did. I'm here.
I mean, I've watched second, third offense people walk around with probation on top of probation on top of probation. Not this lady. First time she's been arrested for drugs. They allege that they found in her home She gets 30 years. Sure, everybody ought to be able to see through this. This is a man that told Linda Ives for years, we're going to get to the bottom of your son's death. But yet when I start making progress, it looks like the people I talk to starts getting time in the penitentiary.
For nearly 23 years, this confession letter that the Ives and Henry families were told nothing about, written and signed by Charlene Wilson on May 28, 1993, in front of 3 public officials to bear witness, was left hidden in the original case files. In the letter, Wilson confesses to a great many of things, including stabbing one of the boys. Only just last year in 2015 did a retired police officer friend of Linda Ives manage to find it and get it to her and her lawyer, R. David Lewis. Linda and her friend went to current Saline County Prosecutor Ken Cassidy with the confession letter, and he not only refused to even look at it, he told them to go see the Saline County Sheriff with the matter. Guess who the current Saline County Sheriff is? Rodney Wright, who just so happens to be Dan Harmon's nephew. So current Saline County Prosecutor Ken Cassidy told Linda Ives and her retired police officer friend to take the Charlene Wilson confession letter that places Dan Harmon on the tracks the night of the murders to Dan Harmon's nephew. It's no wonder the boys' murders have never been officially solved.
But it's not just Charlene Wilson that says that Dan Harmon was on the tracks that night. There's actually a second eyewitness who does not know Charlene Wilson and was not there with her, so there's no way that they could have corroborated their stories. This kid was like 12 years old at the time. He was also on the tracks, and he can place Dan Harmon as being there too. And this is his story.
We didn't realize there was anybody else out there at first. We were, just like I said, goofing off. We come up on, or didn't really come up on, we noticed there were people on the tracks. Saw a flashlight come on and then go back off. They weren't looking in our direction, but we could see the light. And so we kind of quieted down and snuck up a little bit closer to see what was going on. And there was 5 individuals standing on the tracks. One thing that struck my curiosity is, at the time my mother was dating an attorney named Dan Harmon. I knew him well enough to recognize him. There were 2 more individuals that a few minutes after we got there were walking down the railroad tracks that had a rifle and what looked to be a flashlight. And they were more or less kind of minding their own business. And when they realized someone else was on the tracks, they stopped and was fixing to turn around when someone, or Danny, motioned for them to come closer over to where they were. They hesitated and eventually ended up walking on towards the rest of the group. While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I saw a flash, as you would expect with a gunshot at night. We were pretty much terrified and bolted and ran.
So now there's 2 witnesses in Charlene Wilson and Tom Nyhouse who independently of each other and passed polygraphs both identify and place Dan Harmon on the tracks that August night where Kevin and Don were killed. And there's the confession letter from Charlene Wilson that also places Dan Harmon on the tracks that night and includes her admission that she stabbed one of the boys, likely the stab wound found on Don Henry's back that was found in the second autopsy performed by Dr. Burton.
In addition to these 2 people, there's like half a dozen others who were witnesses or knew something about the murder of John Henry and Kevin Ives, and were all subsequently murdered as well in unsolved cases. And the really intriguing part of this is Dan Harmon is still the lead prosecutor. People have not publicly figured out that he is the one who is that he is actually investigating the crime he committed and systematically shutting the investigation down. So every time one of these people comes forward as a potential witness or a lead in the investigation, they end up murdered. And you'll see a news clip where Dan Harmon is asked about that and with a straight face can say, we don't think that those have anything to do with the fact that they were all on the witness list in the train death case.
A number of witnesses and people with information to Kevin and Don's murders would themselves be killed in the years following the murders of Kevin and Don.
Shortly before Keith McCaskill was murdered, he knew that he was fixing to be murdered. He told his family goodbye, he told his friends goodbye. The night of elections in 1988, he took 2 pennies out of his pocket and threw them on the bar there at the wagon wheel and said, "If Jim Steed loses this election, my life isn't worth 2 cents." And he was murdered that night.
McCaskill was indeed murdered, stabbed over 100 times in his garage with blood all over the scene reminiscent of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Most of his flesh had been shredded from his arm in his apparent fight to stave off his attackers.
Jeff Rhodes was a young man from Benton who was murdered in 1989. Shortly before his death, he made a phone call to his dad in Texas and told him he needed to get out of Benton, Arkansas, that he felt he knew too much about the boys on the railroad tracks and the death of Keith McCaskill. A couple of weeks later, Jeff was found dead. He'd been shot in the head. They'd attempted to cut off his head and hands and feet, set him on fire in a dump.
Coney was a friend of Kevin and Don's and was actually with Kevin and Don in the night they were murdered, and would likely be the last friendly face the poor boys would ever get to see again. It's also interesting to note that both Keith McCaskill and Keith Coney were themselves both killed with their murders unresolved before Judge Cole, Harmon, and Garrett shut down the original grand jury investigation, with no public results permitted from the jury. Another interesting thing to note was that during those investigations, despite what witnesses such as the parents had told officials, they still refused to link the murders of their deaths to Kevin and Don, despite the obvious connections.
I think that Mr. McCaskill was probably suffering from a lot of paranoia. And right now the indications are that nobody else was involved.
Might there have been a reason, though, for his paranoia?
I'm sure there was a reason for his paranoia.
Because he talked to the police or the prosecutor?
I don't know that that would be the reason.
What about the murder? Is it connected at all with the grand jury investigation?
Not that we know of.
McCaskill was a witness in the Bryant train deaths investigation. Although police haven't ascertained a motive for the murder, they say there's no connection.
Link this investigation to the deaths of Don Henry or Kevin Ives, and I don't foresee anything in the pursuance of the rest of this investigation that would be anything that would make me change my mind.
So if all of that seems like a lot of information, I get it. This quick clip here is just like a 2-minute summary of this entire case and everything that has happened to put it all into one continuous flow.
We know that Kevin and Don went out around midnight to go hunting. And thanks to Charlene Wilson's confession letter recently unearthed in 2015, we know that her, Dan Harmon, and another individual named Larry Rochelle were going to be at the tracks that night to pick up a drug drop from a plane. Kevin and Don were walking along the tracks and happened to come across Dan Harmon and company on the tracks, as witnessed by a then 12-year-old Tom Nyhouse and his group of friends who were hiding in the nearby bushes watching. A shot was fired either by Harmon's group or the boys, and Kevin and Don took off, as did Nyhouse and the group of other kids that witnessed those events. Next, we have 2 separate witnesses who gave testimony, one being Ronnie Godwin, now deceased, and the other being club owner Mike Crook, who was relaying testimony of what another witness described to him about the following events, and neither knew each other, and both were telling the same story. They were saying that the boys showed up at the Ranchhead grocery store with another friend of theirs, Keith Coney, and this would be sometime after the first incident on the tracks. And Coney then left on his motorcycle when officers Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell showed up and beat the boys unconscious outside the store, probably killing Kevin right there with the reported rifle butt blow to the skull, which showed up in Dr. Burton's second autopsy. Then Campbell and Lane threw the boys into the car and drove off towards the tracks, where Dan Harmon and the others were waiting, and would eventually place the boys on the tracks. Keith Coney, who may have been with the group of kids in the woods that first saw the incident happen at the tracks, went to the club where Keith McCaskill worked and told him about the incident on the tracks. And McCaskill then went to the tracks himself, which makes sense as well, as Charlene Wilson has named McCaskill as one of the people at the tracks by the time she leaves the car that's parked some distance away and reaches the tracks where Dan Harmon, Danny Allen, Keith McCaskill, and others are alleged to be. Wilson doesn't mention Campbell and Lane as being on the tracks in the confession letter, and it's possible that they were first tasked to find the boys after they took off from the tracks, and when Campbell and Lane found them at the Ranchhead grocery store, and after beating them unconscious, they perhaps brought them back to the tracks where Harmon and the others were waiting, and they themselves left the scene, leaving Harmon and the others to place the boys on the tracks for the upcoming train. Also of note, as mentioned earlier, is that Keith Coney would soon be killed as well, one of the number of witnesses killed in the months and years following the murders of Kevin and Don.
This next clip is going to go through several of the FBI documents that confirm what the allegations are presented here, and that this isn't just some sort of conspiracy theory, that there actually was a murder and a cover-up, and that government officials and state employees and elected officials were involved in the drug trade and the cover-up of the murder of these boys, as well as the murder of these boys in some cases, right down to some of the local police, as we will hear in the video.
Former and now deceased, I believe as well, Officer Danny Allen of the Saline County Sheriff's Office, from what I can gather, was allegedly one of the people that was at the tracks that night at some point. Here's an FBI document talking about Allen's polygraph results. Quote, Allen, which is redacted, indicated strong deception regarding knowledge of who killed the boys as well as who put the boys on the tracks. End quote. Allen not only knew who killed the boys, but also who put them on the tracks. It's right there in the wording that Allen knew who killed them. End quote. As well as, end quote, who put them on the tracks. Had it have only been a single person or one party doing the deed, the statement would have read something like, quote, Allen indicated strong deception regarding knowledge of who killed and put the boys on the tracks. End quote. That would have indicated only one party or person involved. The fact that the FBI stated that Allen's polygraph indicated strong deception and he knew who killed the boys as well as who put them on the tracks is very direct and indicative of at least two different and separate parties involved. Here's an Arkansas State Police document detailing Mike Crook's statement about Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane who, quote, beat the boys unconscious and threw them into the back of the car and then drove off, end quote. Which is the same story corroborated by another witness, Ronnie Godwin. Also of note in that report is, quote, Crook states that before Keith McCaskill was killed, McCaskill told him that Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office were following him around, and he was afraid they were going to kill him, end quote. As I said before, there are a whole host of documents from many of the government's alphabet agencies, such as the FBI, CIA, DEA, and so on, pertaining to the murder of Kevin and Don. All the conclusions point to the conspiracy by law enforcement officials to cover it all up, which is exactly what has happened ever since. An FBI file dated February 6, 1995, and in it, it states in part, quote, further, it appears that the special prosecutor appointed in this case, redacted, it says Dan Harmon under that redaction, may have misused his authority and disregarded other leads that may have assisted efforts to bring this investigation to a logical conclusion. Lastly, it also appears that certain Saline County officials may have conspired to cover up the investigation into the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. End quote. Here's an FBI document showing that Dan Harmon himself indeed pushed to be appointed special prosecutor right from the beginning. It states, quote, Little Rock FBI investigation reveals that Benton Chief of Police Rick Elmendorf, Judge John Cole, and Dan Harmon were at Judge Cole's residence when Dan Harmon suggested that he be made special prosecutor for the Ives Henry case. End quote. The document also states, quote, since the beginning of the investigation by the special prosecutor, the case has become riddled with rumors and innuendos. Special Prosecutor Harmon and Assistant Richard Garrett requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police, yet continuously withheld information from them, end quote. So Harmon and Garrett would ask assistance from the Arkansas State Police, but they would withhold information from them, which is what someone who is guilty might do if they were trying to find out what other authorities knew about the case, and to keep ahead of any potential damage, as well as not let any information out that might reveal one's true participation in a crime. So there you go. In the mid-1990s, the FBI knew there was a cover-up in the murders of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, and they also knew Dan Harmon was likely involved. As a matter of fact, there's a whole pile of FBI and other government documents that are partially redacted in some form or another relating to the murder of the two boys.
I can't really imagine what that would be like to be the parents of those boys, to be that woman, Linda Ives, and the federal government is redacting the documents and keeping them hidden and withholding them from you into what happened in the murder of your child. This woman dedicated the rest of her life to trying to get justice for her son, and unfortunately, she just recently passed away without ever seeing that justice. But I hope that that justice is eventually served, or at least for this crime to be acknowledged, because be a shame for her efforts to have been in vain. And rest in peace to Linda Ives. I'm glad that she is no longer going through the pain that I can't even imagine she was experiencing. But it also ties into my overarching concern with the government surveillance, and I think I've mentioned it in a previous video, that part of the reason with the tracking devices and those conspiracies that they talk about, and yes, I know that they can track everything on our phones anyways, and the NSA is already collecting all of our data and text messages and phone calls, and everybody uses the excuse like, who cares? Why are they watching how many times I go to the grocery store? Like, I'm not doing anything wrong. Who cares? And those people are probably right. Most people probably go through their whole lives without ever getting on the government or the intelligence community's radar, and they'll never need to look at any of the data they collect on you. But when you cross their paths, whether willingly or unwillingly, like in the case of Linda Ives, now they have anything that they need to smear you or to discredit you or to falsely accuse you of a crime or to offer that silver or lead plato o plomo, because you can take somebody who is all-American, squeaky clean as Linda Ives, and they can't do anything to smear her. Also, at that time in the 80s, they didn't have the technology to know all of our data and information. I'm sure they would have if they could have, but they can ignore her pleas and requests and court orders and lawsuits to try to get a hold of these documents. They can just dismiss somebody like that. So imagine what they could do to you if they have anything against you where they could discredit you or threaten you in some sort of way. Even if you're squeaky clean, they'll just ignore you. Imagine what they would do to you if you presented a problem for them based on their actions unwillingly crossing paths with you, and now you're a problem for them and they need to discredit you. Imagine what they could do with all of your information. So that's why it's concerning, not for your everyday average Joe, but for the few brave people who do at some point in their lives find themselves in the position where they can stand up to the government and they decide to go for it. That's how those people get destroyed. So to close this video up, I will let Linda Ives speak for herself about the pain and devastation that this has caused her family to see what the government's priorities are and what they are capable of. And I promise in the next video we will get back to the previously scheduled part 2, where we continue along with this story of how the CIA is involved in the drug trade, and now how the drug trade has gone from the streets to the pharmaceutical industry.
There aren't any words in the English language that can describe how it makes you feel as a parent or as a citizen of Arkansas to see what our officials are capable of doing. I think we were just kind of naive, common, ordinary people. Got up and went to work every day and came home and went to bed and assumed that everybody else did the same thing and tried to do what was right. And I think Kevin's death has been the rudest awakening that anybody could ever have to see what really goes on. This is not a political issue with me. We were never a political family. Our lives revolved around the ball field and going to the lake and all of the things that a family does. Until the Arkansas political machine reached into our lives and destroyed the tranquility that we had. And I want the American people to know that we have to stand up against this kind of corruption and we have to hold our officials accountable and make them work for us instead of against us. In my experience, I believe what is happening here in Arkansas is only a small sample as to what is happening nationwide, and I believe that all of America has to stand up and rescue the American system of justice.